Dr. Elijah Carter, a brilliant black surgeon, faces blatant racism when a hospital administrator tries to sabotage his career, questioning his competence and undermining his authority despite his exceptional track record. The story exposes the systemic racism embedded in the healthcare system, as Elijah battles both microaggressions and overt discrimination in a profession where lives are at stake. Tensions escalate when a life-threatening incident forces the hospital's biases into the spotlight, leaving Elijah to confront not only personal prejudice but institutional corruption. This gripping tale of injustice highlights the infuriating reality of racism in America's most critical institutions. The diner was a relic of a simpler time, with its chrome accents glinting under the harsh light of the noonday sun. The smell of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with the low hum of conversation and the occasional clatter of plates. Dr. Nathaniel Carter, a man whose name graced the covers of medical journals and keynote stages across the globe, sat in the corner booth with a cup of black coffee and a well-worn notebook. He was dressed simply, a navy blue sweater over a crisp white shirt, khakis, and scuffed leather loafers that betrayed his modesty. His face bore the weariness of someone accustomed to long nights and the weight of others' expectations. Yet his eyes sparkled with warmth and curiosity. At 53, Nathaniel was a man who had achieved what many could only dream of: wealth, respect, and the ability to shape lives through his groundbreaking work in neurosurgery. And yet, here he was, scribbling notes in the margins of his notebook, as though he were a graduate student preparing for an exam. The world outside the diner window was in flux. The city had become a battleground of ideals, with protests against systemic racism and inequality echoing through the streets. Conversations about justice and reform were unavoidable, splashed across headlines and debated in living rooms. Nathaniel had spent years trying to mend lives, one patient at a time, but the weight of the broader struggle loomed over him like a storm cloud. The bell above the door jingled as another customer entered. A young woman with a baby on her hip, and exhaustion written in the lines of her face. Nathaniel watched as she fumbled with her purse, glancing nervously at the menu, as though calculating what she could afford. He made a mental note to pay for her meal discreetly before leaving. It was a small gesture, but one he often made. For all his accolades, Nathaniel was a man who believed in the quiet power of kindness. Across the room, the waitress, a wiry woman named Margot with a sharp tongue and a heart of gold, approached his table. "You need a refill, Doc?" she asked, her voice a blend of southern hospitality and no-nonsense grit. "Please," Nathaniel replied with a smile, sliding his mug toward her. "How's your granddaughter doing?" Margot's face softened. "She's good. Thanks to you. That surgery you did, I swear, it's like she's a whole new kid. Can't thank you enough." Nathaniel waved off her gratitude with a humble shrug. "She's the fighter, Margot. I just gave her a little help." As Margot walked away to fetch his coffee, Nathaniel felt a prickle of awareness. A man at the counter, a middle-aged customer in a weathered baseball cap, was watching him. Not just watching, but staring. His expression sour and scrutinizing. Nathaniel was no stranger to this look. It was the same one he'd encountered countless times throughout his life, a mixture of suspicion and disdain that seemed to disregard everything he had achieved. To men like that, he wasn't Dr. Nathaniel Carter, world-renowned neurosurgeon. He was just a black man in a diner, occupying a space they thought he didn't belong in. Nathaniel returned to his notebook, determined to ignore the man, but the tension in the room was palpable. The man muttered something to the waitress as she passed, his voice low but loud enough for Nathaniel to catch the words, "Taking up space." Margot's head snapped around, her mouth tightening as she looked toward Nathaniel, then back to the man. "You've got some nerve," she said, her voice icy. "That man's done more for this town than you'll ever know." The man shrugged, unfazed. "Doesn't mean he belongs everywhere." Nathaniel closed his notebook slowly, his hand lingering on the cover. He could feel the eyes of the other patrons flickering toward him, the weight of their silence pressing against his chest. He had long since mastered the art of restraint, but that didn't make these moments any easier. Taking a deep breath, he stood, lifting his coffee mug as if to signal to Margot that he was ready for a refill. As she approached, he caught her eye and gave a slight shake of his head, silently asking her to let it go. She hesitated, her lips pressed into a thin line, but eventually nodded and poured his coffee. The man at the counter snorted. Figures. Nathaniel turned to him, his voice calm but firm. You seem to have a lot to say. Why don't we talk about it? The man blinked, clearly not expecting a direct confrontation. Ain't nothing to talk about, he muttered, looking away. That's what I thought, Nathaniel said evenly, sitting back down. The tension hung in the air like smoke, but Nathaniel's quiet dignity held it at bay. Still, he couldn't shake the knot in his stomach, the familiar ache that came from being reminded that no amount of achievement could shield him from the prejudices of others. As he sipped his coffee, a young girl approached his table, clutching a piece of paper and a pencil. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, her hair tied in a messy ponytail and her cheeks smudged with dirt. Excuse me, she said shyly. Are you the doctor who fixed Emily's head? Nathaniel set his mug down, smiling warmly. I am, and you must be her sister? The girl nodded, her eyes wide with admiration. She says you're a hero. Nathaniel chuckled softly, his chest tightening at the simplicity of her words. Your sister's the real hero. She's braver than I could ever be. The girl beamed and handed him the paper. I drew this for you. It's a thank you. Nathaniel unfolded the paper to reveal a crayon drawing of a man in a white coat with a stethoscope around his neck, standing next to a smiling child. The words, "Thank you, Dr. Carter," were scrawled across the top in shaky handwriting. It's beautiful, Nathaniel said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you. As the girl skipped back to her table, Nathaniel felt a surge of purpose wash over him. Moments like these were why he kept going, why he endured the stares and the muttered comments. He wasn't just a doctor, he was a symbol of possibility, proof that kindness and perseverance could make a difference. But the encounter at the counter lingered in his mind. He had faced men like that his entire life, men who judged him not for who he was, but for what they assumed him to be. He had fought against their expectations every step of the way, but he knew the fight was far from over. Outside, the protest marches had begun again, their chants echoing through the streets. Nathaniel watched from the diner window, his reflection superimposed over the crowds. He thought of his patients, his family, and the generations to come. Change was a slow, grueling process, but it was a fight worth having. As he gathered his things and left the diner, Nathaniel couldn't shake the feeling that this day was only the beginning of something much larger. The storm was brewing, and he would face it with the same quiet resolve that had carried him through every challenge. Before Nathaniel left the diner and walked toward his car, parked just around the corner. The brisk city air carried the faint scent of exhaust and roasted peanuts from a nearby vendor. But his mind was elsewhere, replaying the events inside. As much as he hated to admit it, the man's words lingered, pulling at a thread of frustration Nathaniel thought he had long since tucked away. He unlocked his sleek, black Tesla, an understated nod to his success, and slid into the driver's seat. The leather interior and soft glow of the digital dashboard provided a sense of comfort. But as he adjusted his rearview mirror, he caught a glimpse of the man from the diner watching him from the corner. The man's scowl deepened, and for a brief moment, Nathaniel considered rolling down the window to say something. Instead, he shook his head, started the car, and pulled away. Nathaniel didn't make it far before his phone buzzed in the center console. He tapped the hands-free option, and his assistant's voice filled the car. Dr. Carter, you have a meeting with the hospital board in 30 minutes. They've asked if you could arrive a bit early to go over the proposal. Understood, I'll be there soon, Nathaniel replied, his tone steady, though a hint of irritation crept into his chest. The hospital board meetings always felt like a delicate dance, an exercise in diplomacy as much as medicine. He was used to walking into rooms where his authority was questioned, where he had to prove he belonged despite his accolades. Today, though, the prospect felt especially heavy. The hospital's grand lobby was a gleaming spectacle of marble floors and glass walls, a testament to the institution's prestige. Nathaniel stepped inside, his shoes clicking softly against the polished surface. A young receptionist looked up from her desk, her polite smile faltering slightly as she took in his appearance. Her eyes flicked over his simple sweater and khakis, and for a moment, Nathaniel saw the calculation in her expression, a flicker of doubt about whether he belonged. Can I help you? she asked, her tone overly cautious. I'm here for the board meeting, Nathaniel replied evenly, her brow furrowed slightly. Are you with catering? Nathaniel paused, the question landing like a slap. He took a slow breath, willing his voice to remain calm. No. I'm Dr. Nathaniel Carter. I'm on the agenda. The receptionist blinked, her cheeks flushing as she quickly consulted her computer. Oh, of course, Dr. Carter. My apologies. The boardroom is on the 12th floor, the elevator's just over there. Thank you, he said, his voice clipped but polite. As he walked to the elevator, Nathaniel felt the familiar sting of being underestimated. It wasn't the first time he'd been mistaken for anything but what he was, a doctor, a leader, a pioneer. But today, it grated on him more than usual. He stepped into the elevator, exhaling slowly as the doors closed. He straightened his posture and adjusted his sweater, preparing himself for the next battle. The boardroom was a sprawling space with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. The members of the hospital board were already seated around the long polished table, their conversations a low hum of discussion and laughter. Nathaniel entered quietly, his presence immediately drawing a few curious glances. Ah, Dr. Carter, said Paul Abernathy, the board's chairman, rising to greet him. Paul was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 60s, with a genial smile that barely masked his condescension. Glad you could join us. Nathaniel extended his hand. Good to see you, Paul. Paul's handshake was firm but brief, and as Nathaniel took a seat, he couldn't ignore the subtle shift in the room. A few board members exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable, but charged with an undercurrent of skepticism. He recognized it immediately, the quiet judgment, the sense that he was an outsider in a space where he had every right to be. As the meeting began, Nathaniel presented his proposal for expanding the hospital's neurosurgery department to include a specialized trauma wing, a project he had spent months developing. He spoke with precision and authority, his voice calm but impassioned, as he outlined the benefits for patients and the long-term impact on the hospital's reputation. But as he spoke, Nathaniel couldn't ignore the subtle interruptions. Paul cut him off twice, with questions that seemed designed to undermine his expertise, while another board member, a woman named Margaret Hayes, tapped her pen impatiently, as though waiting for him to finish. When he finally concluded, the room fell silent. Paul leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful but guarded. It's an ambitious proposal, Dr. Carter, he said slowly. But I have to wonder, have you considered the cost implications? This isn't a small investment. Nathaniel nodded, expecting the question. I've accounted for that in the financial breakdown. The long-term savings from reduced patient transfers and increased surgical capacity will more than offset the initial costs. Margaret leaned forward, her tone sharp. But what about the risk of overextending? We're already dealing with budget constraints. Adding a new wing could push us into dangerous territory. Nathaniel met her gaze, refusing to be rattled. I understand your concern, but the data supports this investment. We're in a position to lead the field in trauma care. This is an opportunity to set a standard that other hospitals will follow. The discussion continued, each objection met with a calm, reasoned response from Nathaniel. But no matter how thoroughly he addressed their concerns, he could feel the resistance in the room. The subtle, unspoken doubt that seemed to follow him wherever he went. By the time the meeting ended, Nathaniel was exhausted, not from the discussion itself, but from the effort of maintaining his composure in the face of their quiet biases. As he left the boardroom, Paul caught up with him in the hallway. Nathaniel, a word? Nathaniel turned, his expression neutral. Of course. Paul smiled, his tone taking on a patronizing edge. You did well in there, but you know how these things go. It takes time to convince everyone. You've got to prove you're the right person to lead a project like this. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. With all due respect, Paul, I've already proven that. Paul chuckled lightly, patting Nathaniel's shoulder. I know you think that. Just keep at it. Nathaniel watched him walk away, his words hanging in the air like a bad taste. Keep at it. As though his years of expertise and success weren't enough. As though his accomplishments would never be enough. The drive home was quiet. The hum of the car's engine, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in Nathaniel's mind. He had spent his life navigating these spaces, walking the fine line between professionalism and self-preservation. But lately, it felt harder to ignore the weight of it all. The microaggressions, the quiet dismissals, the constant need to prove himself in ways others never had to. When he pulled into his driveway, Nathaniel sat in the car for a long moment, staring at the modest home he had chosen despite his wealth. It was a symbol of his humility, his desire to stay grounded. But tonight, it felt like a reminder of the distance between his achievements and the respect he was owed. Inside, he found solace in the familiar comfort of his home. He set his keys on the counter and sank into the worn leather armchair in the living room. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Nathaniel reached for his notebook, flipping through its pages, until he found the notes he had been working on earlier. The words blurred together, his thoughts scattered by the day's events. For the first time in a long time, he felt a pang of doubt. He closed the notebook, his hand lingering on the cover. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but tonight, the weight of it all pressed heavily on his shoulders. Nathaniel Carter awoke the next morning to a barrage of notifications on his phone. His assistant, Simone, had already called twice, and there were multiple emails flagged as urgent. He sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes as he unlocked the screen. The first email froze him in place. Subject: urgent, accusations against Dr. Carter. Nathaniel's heart sank as he read. An anonymous source had leaked allegations of financial impropriety involving the proposed trauma wing project. The email claimed he had funneled funds from the hospital's budget into personal accounts. A bold and baseless accusation. Attached were doctored documents meant to incriminate him. Worse, the local news outlets had already picked up the story. Nathaniel sat still for a moment, staring at the screen. This wasn't a misunderstanding or an error, it was a deliberate attack. Someone had gone to great lengths to discredit him. Simone's voice broke through his thoughts. She was calling again. "Dr. Carter, I just saw the news, are you okay?" Her voice was frantic. Nathaniel cleared his throat, trying to steady his own voice. "I'm fine, Simone. It's nonsense, but it's dangerous nonsense." "They've called an emergency board meeting," Simone continued. "It's at noon. They're expecting you to defend yourself." "Of course they are," Nathaniel muttered, pacing the room. "I'll be there." He ended the call and immediately dialed his attorney, Evelyn Mitchell, a sharp and methodical woman who had represented him in smaller disputes before she picked up on the second ring. "I assume you've seen the news," Nathaniel said, his tone clipped. "I have," Evelyn replied, her voice calm but firm. "I'm already looking into the source of the leak, but you need to tread carefully, Nathaniel. These kinds of accusations stick, even if they're baseless." Nathaniel leaned against the kitchen counter, his grip tightening on the phone. "I've worked too hard to let someone smear me like this. Who could have done this?" "That's the question, isn't it?" Evelyn said. "My gut says it's someone inside the hospital, a rival on the board. Perhaps these kinds of attacks don't come out of nowhere." Nathaniel exhaled slowly. "I'll be at the meeting. Be ready in case I need to escalate this legally." When Nathaniel arrived at the hospital, the atmosphere was tense. The usually bustling lobby was quieter than usual, the staff casting him furtive glances as he walked through. The weight of suspicion hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. He entered the boardroom to find Paul Abernathy already seated, flanked by Margaret Hayes and two other board members. Their expressions ranged from guarded to openly hostile. Paul gestured for Nathaniel to sit. "We have a situation, Dr. Carter," Paul began, his tone grave but tinged with something Nathaniel couldn't quite place. Satisfaction, perhaps. "You've seen the accusations." "They're fabricated," Nathaniel said, keeping his tone measured. "Whoever leaked them has an agenda." Margaret folded her arms, her gaze sharp. "The documents look convincing, Dr. Carter. How do you explain that?" Nathaniel leaned forward, meeting her gaze head-on. "I explain it by pointing out how easy it is to forge financial records. I have nothing to hide, and I've already instructed my attorney to investigate the source of this slander." Paul held up a hand. "Let's not get defensive. The optics here are bad, Nathaniel. Whether or not the accusations are true, this puts the hospital in a precarious position. We can't afford a scandal." Nathaniel clenched his jaw. "I'm not the one bringing scandal to this hospital. Someone is trying to sabotage me, and we need to focus on finding out who." Margaret exchanged a glance with Paul, and Nathaniel's stomach churned. They weren't on his side. Paul sighed theatrically. "We've decided to suspend you, effective immediately, while we conduct an internal review. This is for the good of the hospital." Nathaniel's voice was steel. "You're suspending me based on anonymous accusations without a shred of credible evidence." "It's a precaution," Paul said, feigning sympathy. "You understand?" Nathaniel stood slowly, his hands resting on the edge of the table. "I've dedicated years to this hospital. I've brought innovation, recognition, and funding. And this is how you repay me?" "It's not personal," Margaret said, though the faint smirk tugging at her lips said otherwise. Nathaniel stared at them, his pulse pounding. "You're making a mistake." Paul folded his hands. "We'll be in touch." Nathaniel left the boardroom, his chest tight with a mix of fury and determination. This wasn't just an attack on him, it was an attack on everything he had worked for, and he wasn't going to let them win. Back in his office, Nathaniel met with Evelyn and Simone to strategize. Simone paced the room, her frustration bubbling over. "This is ridiculous," she said. "Everyone here knows what you've done for this hospital. They should be standing behind you, not throwing you to the wolves." "They're protecting their own interests," Nathaniel said. "I've seen this playbook before. They think if they push me out, the controversy will go away." "But who's behind it?" Simone asked, throwing up her hands. "Who would do this?" Evelyn tapped her pen against a legal pad. "It's someone with access to internal records. The level of detail in those documents suggests an insider." Nathaniel's mind raced, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Paul's smirk, Margaret's hostility. The way they had both seemed almost too prepared for this meeting. "It's Paul and Margaret," Nathaniel said finally. "They've been opposing the trauma wing from the start. This is their way of killing it. And me." Evelyn nodded. "It's a strong possibility, but we need proof." Nathaniel straightened his shoulders. "Then we get proof." As the day wore on, Nathaniel's resolve hardened. He called in favors from trusted colleagues, combed through hospital records, and enlisted Evelyn's legal team to start digging. The hours blurred together, and by the time evening fell, they had uncovered a critical lead. Simone burst into the office, a printout clutched in her hand. "We found something. Margaret has ties to a private development firm, the same firm that's been pushing for the hospital to sell the land earmarked for the trauma wing." Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. "So she's sabotaging the project to clear the way for a sale." "Exactly," Simone said. "And Paul's just as dirty. He's been receiving donations from that firm for years." Evelyn leaned forward. "This is good, but it's not enough to clear your name. We need a smoking gun." Nathaniel nodded. "Then we keep digging." The next day, Nathaniel received an unexpected call from a hospital whistleblower who had seen the news. The voice on the other end was shaky, but determined. "They've been cooking the books for months," the whistleblower said. "I have copies of emails between Margaret and Paul. They've been orchestrating this whole thing." Nathaniel's heart raced. "Can you send me the files?" "I'll do better," the whistleblower said. "Meet me tonight, I'll give you everything." Nathaniel agreed, setting the meeting for a neutral location. As he hung up, he felt a mix of hope and trepidation. This could be the breakthrough he needed, or it could be a trap. That night, Nathaniel arrived at the meeting spot, a quiet cafe on the edge of the city. The whistleblower, a young accountant named Lisa, slid a folder across the table. Inside were damning emails, spreadsheets, and handwritten notes. "This proves everything," Lisa said. "But you need to act fast. Margaret and Paul are covering their tracks." Nathaniel thanked her, his mind already racing with how to leverage this information. As he left the cafe, folder in hand, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about exposing a system that thrived on corruption. But as Nathaniel stepped into the street, headlights blazed toward him. A black SUV screeched to a halt, and two men stepped out, their faces obscured by hats and masks. Before Nathaniel could react, they lunged toward him, grabbing for the folder. He fought back, adrenaline surging as he held on to the evidence. The scuffle spilled into the street, drawing the attention of a nearby police officer. The attackers cursed and fled, leaving Nathaniel shaken, but uninjured. The officer approached, his hand on his holstered weapon. "Sir, what's going on here?" Nathaniel held up the folder. Someone just tried to steal this. It's evidence. The officer's gaze hardened. Evidence of what? Nathaniel hesitated, realizing how precarious the situation was. Corruption at the hospital. The officer's expression was unreadable. Come with me. Nathaniel followed reluctantly, clutching the folder. The stakes had never been higher, and the path ahead was fraught with danger. But as he walked toward the waiting patrol car, his resolve only grew. This wasn't over. The folder Nathaniel clutched was more than just paper. It was a lifeline to his name, his career, and his truth. As he sat in the back of the patrol car, the city lights blurred past the window. His heart pounded as he replayed the attack. Who had sent those men? Margaret, Paul. Both. Their desperation to suppress the truth confirmed just how damning the evidence in the folder was. The officer who had intervened, a young man named Officer Daniels, occasionally glanced at Nathaniel through the rearview mirror. His expression was unreadable, but his tense posture hinted at his own suspicions. That's quite a story you've got, Daniels said, breaking the silence. A random assault for a folder of documents? It's not random, Nathaniel replied, his tone calm but firm. That folder exposes corruption at the highest levels of the hospital. I need it secured before they try again. Daniels arched an eyebrow, but didn't respond, his skepticism palpable. Nathaniel's patience was thinning, but he chose his words carefully. You don't have to believe me, Nathaniel continued. But if you're half the officer you appear to be, you'll take a closer look at what's inside. The patrol car pulled into the precinct, its red and blue lights casting flickering shadows on the brick facade. Daniels parked and opened the back door, gesturing for Nathaniel to step out. Clutching the folder tightly, Nathaniel followed him into the station, his gaze darting around for any sign of danger. Inside, the room buzzed with quiet activity. Officers shuffled papers, took calls, and exchanged knowing glances when Nathaniel entered. He felt their judgment pressing on him, the weight of their assumptions. Another black man escorted into custody, another presumed criminal. Daniels directed Nathaniel to a small interrogation room. Wait here, I'll get someone to take your statement. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. I didn't agree to this, I'm not under arrest. Not yet, Daniels said, his tone sharp. But until I verify your story, I can't just let you walk out. Nathaniel sat stiffly at the table, the folder in his lap. The cold metal chair pressed uncomfortably against his back, and the fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, adding to his mounting frustration. Time ticked by, and the longer he waited, the more his unease grew. Across town, Evelyn Mitchell was pacing her office. She had received Nathaniel's cryptic message about the meeting with the whistleblower, but hours had passed with no follow-up. Her calls to his phone went unanswered. Her instincts told her something was wrong. Simone barged into the office, her expression frantic. I just heard from a nurse at the hospital. Nathaniel was seen getting into a patrol car. What's going on? Evelyn's stomach sank. He's in police custody? Simone nodded. And word is already spreading. The board is loving this, they're spinning it as evidence of guilt. Evelyn grabbed her coat. Stay here and keep digging into Margaret and Paul. If they've escalated to this level, they're desperate. I'll get Nathaniel. Back at the precinct, Daniels returned to the interrogation room with a senior officer, Lieutenant Hall, a gruff man with gray at his temples and a deep crease in his brow. Hall dropped into the chair across from Nathaniel, sizing him up. You've caused quite a stir tonight, Hall said, folding his arms. Mind telling me what this is all about? Nathaniel slid the folder onto the table, his movements deliberate. This contains evidence of corruption at St. Mercy Hospital. High-ranking board members are implicated. I was attacked for it tonight. All I want is for this to be properly investigated. Hall leaned forward, flipping open the folder. His eyes scanned the first page, then the next. As he read, his expression darkened. He exchanged a glance with Daniels, whose skepticism seemed to waver. This is heavy, Hall admitted. If it's real, it is, Nathaniel said firmly. And if you don't act on it, the hospital and the people it serves will pay the price. Hall sighed, leaning back. You've got a lot of enemies, Dr. Carter. You're sure you want to keep pushing this? Nathaniel's gaze didn't falter. I've come too far to back down now. Evelyn burst into the precinct like a storm, her heels clicking against the tile floor. She found Nathaniel still in the interrogation room, the tension palpable, as Hall and Daniels reviewed the folder's contents. "Dr. Carter," she announced, her voice cutting through the room, "you're done here." Hall looked up, his brow furrowing. "We're just trying to verify." "You've had your time," Evelyn interrupted, pulling a business card from her pocket and placing it on the table. "Anything else you need can be directed to my office. My client is leaving." Nathaniel rose, his relief masked by a steely composure. Daniels hesitated but stepped aside, allowing Evelyn to lead him out. As they exited the precinct, Evelyn turned to him. "What the hell happened?" "I have everything we need," Nathaniel said, clutching the folder. "But Margaret and Paul won't stop tonight proved that." Evelyn nodded, her jaw tight. "Then we don't stop either." The next morning, the city awoke to a firestorm. Evelyn had leaked key portions of the evidence to the press, enough to ignite public outrage without jeopardizing the full case. News outlets ran headlines about the alleged corruption at St. Mercy Hospital, while social media exploded with calls for accountability. Margaret and Paul were caught off guard. At a hastily called press conference, they denied the allegations, feigning shock and indignation, but their carefully rehearsed statements couldn't quell the growing tide against them. Inside the hospital, staff whispered nervously. Some rallied behind Nathaniel, sharing stories of his integrity and dedication. Others distanced themselves, wary of being caught in the crossfire. By midday, Evelyn received an anonymous tip. A source within the hospital had more evidence, records that would definitively link Margaret and Paul to the corruption scheme. But the source was hesitant, fearing retaliation. Nathaniel's resolve hardened. "We need that evidence." Evelyn frowned. "It's risky, they've already tried to silence you once." "Then we move quickly," Nathaniel said. "If we can expose them before they regroup, we can end this." That evening, Nathaniel and Evelyn met the source at a nondescript parking garage. The dim lighting and echoing footsteps set Nathaniel on edge, but he pressed forward, determined. The source, a nervous hospital administrator named Rachel, handed over a USB drive. "This is everything," she whispered. "Emails, financial records, meeting transcripts. It's all there." "Thank you," Nathaniel said sincerely. "This will make a difference." As Rachel hurried away, Evelyn inspected the drive. If this checks out, it's game over for them. But before they could leave, the sound of tires screeching echoed through the garage. A black SUV barreled toward them, its headlights blinding. Nathaniel and Evelyn darted behind a concrete pillar as the vehicle skidded to a halt. Two men stepped out, their faces obscured by masks. One of them pointed directly at Nathaniel. "Give us the drive." Nathaniel's pulse raced, but he didn't move. Evelyn clutched his arm, her voice low. "Nathaniel, don't." "No," Nathaniel said firmly, stepping into the open. "You want it? Come and take it." The men advanced, but the sound of a distant siren suddenly pierced the air. Startled, the attackers retreated, jumping back into the SUV and speeding away. Evelyn exhaled shakily. "They're getting desperate." Nathaniel nodded, gripping the drive tightly. "And we're getting close." The stage was set for a decisive showdown. With the new evidence in hand, Nathaniel and Evelyn prepared to take their fight to the public. But the looming question remained: how far would Margaret and Paul go to protect their empire? The conference room at St. Mercy Hospital was suffused with tension, the air thick with anticipation. Board members sat around the table, their expressions a mix of anxiety and forced confidence. At the head of the table, Margaret Weaver adjusted her blazer, the same unflappable composure she wore at every meeting in place. Paul Stanton, her ever-loyal accomplice, sat to her left, his jaw tight, his eyes flickering with barely concealed agitation. Nathaniel Carter stood at the opposite end of the room, his posture relaxed but resolute. Beside him was Evelyn Mitchell, her piercing gaze fixed on Margaret. Between them, a large screen displayed the words, "St. Mercy Hospital Internal Review, Evidence Presentation." The atmosphere was electric. Several hospital employees had gathered in the back of the room to witness what promised to be a pivotal moment in the hospital's history. Whispers of Nathaniel's fight against corruption had spread, igniting curiosity and cautious hope among the staff. Margaret broke the silence, her voice honeyed but steely. "Dr. Carter, while we're all eager to hear your allegations, I must remind you that this is a professional institution. Wild accusations will not be tolerated." Nathaniel met her gaze, unflinching. I'm not here to accuse, Margaret. I'm here to present the truth. Whether you tolerate it or not is your problem. The tension spiked. Margaret's carefully composed smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Evelyn stepped forward, placing a USB drive on the table. Contained on this drive is a detailed record of financial discrepancies, meeting transcripts, and emails that show exactly how you and Paul have funneled hospital funds into private accounts while cutting essential programs that cost lives. Paul scoffed, leaning back in his chair. This is absurd. You're relying on stolen documents. Any half-decent lawyer would dismantle this in court. Evelyn smirked. Then it's a good thing we've already had them authenticated by an independent forensic analyst. Every piece is admissible in court. A murmur rippled through the room. Margaret's knuckles whitened as she gripped the table edge. You think you can barge in here and dismantle years of leadership with a few emails? Margaret's voice had grown cold, her control slipping. You don't understand what it takes to run a hospital like this. Difficult decisions are made every day. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Difficult decisions like pocketing funds meant for cancer treatment programs, or blacklisting doctors who questioned you. Is that what leadership means to you? Margaret leaned forward, her mask fully slipping. Do you honestly believe you can beat us, Carter? You've already been ostracized, humiliated. You're a rogue doctor with nothing left to lose, clinging to some misguided vendetta. Nathaniel stepped closer to the table, his voice low but powerful. You're right. I've lost almost everything. But the difference between you and me is that I still have integrity, and I'm not standing alone anymore. He gestured to the screen. Evelyn clicked a button on her laptop, and the screen filled with damning visuals. Spreadsheets showing funds redirected to private accounts, emails with Margaret's and Paul's names prominently featured, and testimonies from staff members who had come forward, emboldened by Nathaniel's fight. Margaret and Paul's faces paled as the board members leaned in, murmuring in disbelief. This is fabricated, Margaret snapped, her voice shaking with anger. It's a smear campaign orchestrated by a disgruntled employee. Nathaniel crossed his arms. Then explain the financial records, Margaret. Explain why patients in critical condition were turned away because of budget constraints, while you were approving luxury retreats under the hospital's name. Paul shot to his feet, slamming his hand on the table. Enough, you don't have the authority to question us. We've built this hospital into one of the finest institutions in the state. And you've done it on the backs of the people who trusted you, Nathaniel shot back. Patient staff. The community you've betrayed, every single one of them. Margaret's lips curled into a sneer. Do you think anyone cares about your self-righteous crusade? The board will side with us? They know where their bread is buttered? Evelyn's voice cut through the room like a blade. You might want to rethink that assumption. She nodded toward the back of the room. A group of journalists, cameras in hand, had entered quietly and begun filming the proceedings. The employees present watched, their expressions a mixture of astonishment and vindication. Paul's face turned ashen. You had no right? The public has every right to know, Evelyn interjected, and they'll demand answers. The days of you operating in the shadows are over. Margaret's control snapped. You think this will ruin us? We'll bury you in lawsuits. You'll do nothing, came a voice from the doorway. All eyes turned to see the state attorney general, flanked by two investigators. Margaret's face drained of color. Paul sank back into his chair. We've been reviewing the evidence for weeks, the attorney general said, stepping into the room. And after tonight, I think we have more than enough to proceed with criminal charges. Margaret's composure crumbled. You can't do this. You did this to yourself, Nathaniel said, his voice filled with quiet triumph. You thought you were untouchable. You're not. The investigators moved forward, producing handcuffs. Margaret recoiled, but there was no escape. Paul muttered curses under his breath as he too was restrained. The board members sat frozen, their silence damning. As Margaret was led away, she turned to Nathaniel, her face twisted with fury. You think this is over? You'll regret this, Carter. Nathaniel held her gaze, unshaken. The only thing I regret is not fighting back sooner. As the room emptied, Evelyn turned to Nathaniel, a small smile breaking her usually serious demeanor. You did it. They're finished. Nathaniel exhaled, the weight of the moment sinking in. We did it. But this isn't just about Margaret and Paul, it's about rebuilding what they destroyed. He turned to the employees who had gathered, their faces a mixture of relief and hope. This hospital can be what it was meant to be, a place where lives are saved, not exploited, but it's going to take all of us. The staff erupted in applause, their faith in Nathaniel rekindled. As Nathaniel stepped into the cool night air, Evelyn by his side, he felt a rare sense of peace. But he knew the battle wasn't entirely over. There would be fallout, resistance, and attempts to dismantle the reforms he and Evelyn had fought so hard to initiate. "We've won this round," Evelyn said, as if reading his thoughts. "But the fight's not over." Nathaniel nodded, his resolve unwavering. "Then we'll keep fighting." The city lights stretched before them, a reminder of the challenges ahead, and the possibilities for change. The community center's hall was packed with restless energy. Rows of folding chairs held community members, hospital staff, and journalists, while others leaned against the walls, their murmurs a low hum of tension. At the center of the room stood Nathaniel Carter, calm but resolute, his gaze fixed on Margaret Weaver, who was seated at the panel table alongside Paul Stanton and a few other board members of St. Mercy Hospital. A large projector screen loomed behind them, waiting for the evidence Nathaniel had promised to unveil. Margaret adjusted her blazer, her lips curling into a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. She leaned toward her microphone. "Dr. Carter," she began smoothly, her tone clipped but pleasant, "it's clear you've gone to great lengths to orchestrate this public display. But if your goal is to undermine the hospital's leadership, I'm afraid you're wasting your time. We have nothing to hide." Nathaniel's voice was calm, but the underlying steel was unmistakable. "Transparency isn't a waste of time, Margaret, especially when lives are at stake." The crowd buzzed at his words. Margaret shot a quick glance at Paul, who gave her a curt nod. She straightened, her smile tightening. "Then by all means, let's proceed. We're all curious to see what you've brought." Nathaniel gestured to Evelyn Mitchell, who stood near the projector. She loaded a USB drive into the connected laptop, and the screen lit up with an email thread. The subject line read, "Reallocation of funds, priority approval." "This is just the beginning," Nathaniel said, turning to the crowd. "For years, Margaret Weaver and Paul Stanton have been redirecting hospital funds away from critical care programs, like pediatric oncology and the charity care program, to pad their own pockets and fund unnecessary luxury upgrades." A collective gasp rippled through the audience as Evelyn clicked to reveal the email's contents. The screen displayed correspondence between Margaret, Paul, and a few other key figures. Margaret's email was highlighted, her directive chillingly clear. Cut another 15% from the oncology unit, focus on private suite expansions, discreetly adjust the budget to cover the shortfall, ensure no paper trail. Margaret's smile faltered for the first time. She reached for her microphone. "This is a gross misrepresentation," she snapped, her voice a shade too sharp. "These emails are taken out of context." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "Out of context, let's provide more then." He nodded to Evelyn, who switched to a spreadsheet. It detailed budget adjustments over the past 5 years. The highlighted sections showed stark discrepancies between allocated funds and actual expenditures. Pediatric oncology had suffered a 40% reduction in funding, while hospital administrative costs, including executive retreats and private lounge renovations, had ballooned. "Your own records paint the picture," Nathaniel said, his voice unwavering. "You cut life-saving programs to fund perks for yourselves." Paul Stanton's composure cracked. He leaned forward, his voice tinged with panic. "Do you have any idea how difficult it is to run a hospital? Every decision we've made has been to ensure the hospital's long-term survival." Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. "Survival? Tell that to the families of the children who were turned away from oncology because they couldn't afford care. Tell that to the staff whose wages were frozen while you approved a 6-figure retreat to a private island." The tension in the room thickened. Whispers swelled into louder murmurs. A woman in the audience stood, her face flushed with anger. "My son was one of those kids," she shouted. "You told us there was no funding, and we had to go somewhere else. He didn't make it." Her words hit the room like a thunderclap. Margaret's face drained of color, and Paul glanced away, his jaw clenched. The crowd's murmurs grew angrier, their disbelief and fury palpable. Margaret gripped her microphone tightly. "I will not stand here and be vilified by baseless accusations. Dr. Carter is clearly attempting to deflect from his own professional failings." Nathaniel stepped forward, his voice sharp and cutting through the rising chaos. "If you want to talk about failings, let's talk about your suppression of whistleblowers." Evelyn clicked to the next slide, which displayed a list of names. Each was accompanied by an internal report of grievances filed against the administration. The documents showed a pattern of retaliation, with employees who raised concerns being demoted, silenced, or forced to resign. The audience gasped again. A nurse stood up, tears brimming in her eyes. "That's why I left," she said, her voice shaking. "I tried to report unsafe conditions in the ER, and you ruined my career." Margaret opened her mouth to retort, but her words caught in her throat. She was losing control of the room. Paul slammed his hand on the table, his face red with anger. "This is a circus. None of this proves misconduct. Do you honestly believe a disgruntled former doctor and a handful of cherry-picked emails are enough to discredit us?" Nathaniel stared at Paul, his voice steady, but laced with quiet fury. "Do you think I'd come here without undeniable proof?" Evelyn hit play on a video file. The screen displayed a secretly recorded conversation between Paul and another executive. Their voices were unmistakable. "Paul, we can't afford another audit if anyone asks. Say the funds were reallocated for operational improvements. No one reads those reports anyway." Executive, "What about Carter? He's been asking questions." Paul, "We'll handle him if he doesn't shut up. We'll make it his problem." The room erupted. Margaret's composure shattered, her mask of control giving way to raw panic. Paul stood, his eyes wide, his breathing shallow. This was taken illegally. It's inadmissible." Nathaniel turned to him, his voice calm but unyielding. "This isn't a courtroom, Paul. This is accountability." Margaret's voice trembled as she addressed the audience. "You can't believe this Dr. Carter has been out to destroy me from the start." "Enough!" a booming voice interrupted. The room fell silent as the state attorney general entered, flanked by investigators. "We've seen enough," he said, holding up a folder. "Based on the evidence submitted to my office, we're opening a formal investigation into St. Mercy Hospital's administration, Margaret Weaver and Paul Stanton. You are hereby placed on administrative leave, pending further action." The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, drowning out Margaret's protests. She and Paul were escorted out, their faces masks of disbelief and humiliation. Nathaniel stood at the front of the room, watching them go. His shoulders were squared, his expression calm. But as the cheers swelled around him, he couldn't ignore the knot of uncertainty in his chest. The fight was far from over, and the road ahead would be anything but easy. Evelyn touched his arm, her voice low. "You did it, Nathaniel." He nodded, his resolve firm. "We've started, but now we need to finish." The aftermath of the explosive meeting rippled far beyond the walls of the community center. News outlets scrambled to cover the scandal, broadcasting Nathaniel Carter's evidence and the video of Paul Stanton's damning conversation. The hospital board announced a full-scale investigation into St. Mercy Hospital's financial practices, and Margaret Weaver and Paul Stanton were suspended indefinitely within days. Their faces appeared in headlines, the public pressure mounting for accountability. For Nathaniel, the days following the confrontation were a whirlwind of media attention, legal proceedings, and cautious hope. Evelyn and a growing team of advocates worked tirelessly to comb through additional files, ensuring no stone was left unturned. Whistleblowers began stepping forward, nurses, doctors, and even a former board member, emboldened by Nathaniel's bravery. In the weeks that followed, the Attorney General's office launched an audit of the hospital's finances. The investigation uncovered years of financial mismanagement, confirming that funds had been systematically diverted from critical care programs to luxurious perks for executives. Public outcry intensified as more evidence came to light, including internal memos detailing how complaints from staff and patients were buried to protect the hospital's image. The fallout was swift. Margaret Weaver and Paul Stanton resigned under pressure, avoiding formal charges in exchange for hefty fines and public apologies. While some called it a slap on the wrist, their departure marked a turning point. More significantly, St. Mercy's board announced sweeping reforms. A new leadership team, with a mandate for transparency. Reinstatement of funding for the pediatric oncology and charity care programs, the establishment of an independent oversight committee to ensure ongoing accountability. The reforms weren't perfect, but they were a start. For the first time in years, staff at St. Mercy began to feel a glimmer of hope that things might truly change. For Nathaniel, the victory was bittersweet. He'd achieved what many thought impossible, exposing corruption at one of the city's most powerful institutions. But the fight had come at a cost. His name was now inextricably linked with the scandal, and not everyone saw him as a hero. Some colleagues whispered that he'd tarnished the hospital's reputation, while others accused him of being motivated by personal vendettas. Yet, Nathaniel found strength in the support of his allies. Evelyn reminded him daily of the lives he had touched, from the families who would now receive the care they needed to the staff who no longer feared speaking out. He also found unexpected camaraderie among the community members who rallied around him, their gratitude and encouragement reinforcing his belief in the power of collective action. More importantly, Nathaniel rediscovered a sense of purpose. The ordeal had reignited his passion for medicine, not just as a healer, but as an advocate for equity in healthcare. He began meeting with community leaders to discuss broader systemic issues, from the lack of funding in underserved areas to the implicit biases that influenced patient care. The ripples of Nathaniel's actions spread beyond St. Mercy. Inspired by the hospital's scandal, other institutions began facing scrutiny. Activists and investigative journalists took up the mantle, uncovering similar stories of corruption and mismanagement in hospitals across the state. In response, lawmakers introduced new legislation aimed at increasing transparency and accountability in healthcare. The Carter Act, as it came to be known, required hospitals to publicly disclose financial allocations and established penalties for retaliating against whistleblowers. Nathaniel was invited to testify before the state Senate, his measured but impassioned testimony solidifying his reputation as a champion for justice. At the same time, the community around St. Mercy rallied to ensure the hospital's reform stuck. A grassroots coalition formed to monitor the institution's progress, providing a model for citizen-led oversight that other communities began replicating. One afternoon, Nathaniel found himself back in the pediatric oncology wing, now bustling with activity. The walls, once bare and sterile, were adorned with colorful murals painted by local artists. A small group of children laughed as they played in a newly renovated activity room. Dr. Susan Kim, one of the department's lead oncologists, approached Nathaniel with a warm smile. "It's good to see you back," she said, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. "This," she gestured to the vibrant scene before them, "wouldn't have been possible without you." Nathaniel felt a lump rise in his throat. "It wasn't just me," he said quietly. "It was all of us." As he walked through the ward, he stopped to speak with families, their expressions ranging from cautious optimism to tearful relief. Each conversation reminded him why he had fought so hard, why the sacrifices had been worth it. Later that evening, Nathaniel visited Evelyn's office, where the two friends shared a rare moment of quiet. Evelyn handed him a framed photo, a candid shot of him speaking at the community meeting, his face alight with passion. "For your new office," she said with a grin. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "New office? You didn't think you were going to stop at one hospital, did you?" she teased. "There's a whole system out there that needs fixing." Nathaniel chuckled, shaking his head. One battle at a time. As Nathaniel drove home that night, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The road ahead was still daunting, and there were no guarantees that the progress they'd made would last. But for the first time in years, he felt a sense of hope. Not just for himself, but for the community he'd come to love. His phone buzzed with a message from Evelyn. "Got a call from a clinic in Midtown. They're dealing with similar issues and want our help. What do you think?" Nathaniel smiled, his fingers hovering over the screen before typing a reply. "Let's talk tomorrow." He knew the fight was far from over, but he also knew he wasn't alone. Together, they could keep pushing for the change they believed in. One step, one hospital, one community at a time. Nathaniel Carter stood at the edge of the hospital courtyard, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, amber glow over the city. The laughter of children echoed faintly from the pediatric wing behind him, a bittersweet reminder of why he had fought so hard. It had been months since he first stepped into the chaos of St. Mercy's corruption, and though the battle was far from over, tonight, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The man who had walked into that meeting months ago, a surgeon burdened by disillusionment, was not the same man standing here now. Nathaniel had faced not only systemic corruption, but also the weight of his own doubts and fears. Yet, through the turmoil, he had discovered a resilience he hadn't realized he possessed. The ordeal had stripped away any lingering naivety about the healthcare system, but it had also fortified his resolve to fight for something better. Nathaniel's journey had been as much about reclaiming his own sense of purpose as it was about exposing injustice. At the start, he had struggled with feelings of helplessness, frustrated by the impenetrable walls of bureaucracy and prejudice. But with each step, whether uncovering evidence, rallying allies, or facing down Paul Stanton, he had grown more confident in his ability to effect change. The very traits that others had underestimated in him, his humility, his compassion, his steadfastness, had become his greatest strengths. Now, as he looked out over the community he had come to see as family, Nathaniel felt a profound sense of clarity. The fight for justice wasn't a one-time battle, it was a lifelong commitment. His role as a healer extended far beyond the operating room. Whether through advocacy, mentorship, or activism, he was determined to use his voice to uplift others and challenge the inequities that plagued the system. Nathaniel's story was a microcosm of larger, deeply ingrained societal issues. The corruption at St. Mercy wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a system that too often prioritized profit over people. The redirection of funds from critical care programs to executive luxuries was emblematic of the broader inequities that disproportionately affected vulnerable communities. The scandal also laid bare the racial biases that permeated the system. Nathaniel's initial encounters with Stanton and the board had been steeped in subtle condescension, their dismissive attitudes a reflection of a society that often undervalued black excellence. Even his allies, like Mitchell, had struggled to overcome their ingrained assumptions. These moments underscored the insidious nature of systemic racism, not just as overt acts of discrimination, but as the countless small indignities that compounded over time. Yet, amidst the ugliness, Nathaniel's story also highlighted the power of solidarity. The community that had rallied behind him, the allies who had risked their own positions to stand by his side, and the grassroots movement that emerged in the wake of the scandal all demonstrated the potential for collective action. Change, the story suggested, wasn't just possible. It was inevitable when people united around a shared vision of justice. For those who followed Nathaniel's journey, the message was clear. Progress is messy, painful, and often slow. But it is worth fighting for. Nathaniel's courage, in the face of overwhelming odds, served as a reminder that change begins with individuals who refuse to stay silent. His story encouraged viewers to examine their own roles within the systems they navigate, to ask uncomfortable questions, and to challenge the status quo, even when it feels insurmountable. To those who have faced injustice, Nathaniel's resilience was a beacon of hope. His story acknowledged the frustration, exhaustion, and fear that often accompany the fight for equity. But it also showed that even small acts of defiance, speaking out in a meeting, sharing a story, supporting a colleague, could ripple outward, creating waves of transformation. For those in positions of privilege or power, the story served as a wake-up call. It challenged them to confront their biases, to listen to voices they might have overlooked, and to use their influence to dismantle harmful systems rather than perpetuating them. The fight for justice wasn't limited to healthcare. The themes of Nathaniel's story resonated across industries, communities, and movements, reminding everyone that the pursuit of equity was a universal struggle. His journey was a testament to the power of courage, empathy, and perseverance. As the evening sky deepened into shades of violet and indigo, Nathaniel made his way back inside the hospital. The atmosphere was different now. Lighter, more hopeful staff members greeted him with smiles, their gratitude unspoken but deeply felt. The changes underway at St. Mercy were still fragile, but they were real. New leaders had taken the reins, transparency measures were being implemented, and the community had a seat at the table for the first time. Nathaniel passed the mural in the pediatric ward, pausing to admire the vibrant colors and intricate details. A small plaque beneath it bore the names of the artists, local children who had been treated at the hospital. One of the names caught his eye: Maya Williams, a young girl whose parents had written him a heartfelt letter thanking him for ensuring the program's survival. It was in these moments, the quiet, personal victories, that Nathaniel found the strength to keep going. He thought of Evelyn's words about continuing the fight, about taking what they had learned here and applying it elsewhere. The prospect was daunting, but it was also exhilarating. Nathaniel had spent years believing his impact was confined to the operating room. Now, he saw the truth. His reach was far greater. Nathaniel's journey was one of transformation, not just for himself, but for everyone his actions had touched. It was a story of resilience in the face of systemic injustice, of a community's power to demand accountability, and of the enduring hope that progress, while difficult, is always possible. To those watching, the story offered both a challenge and an invitation. The challenge was to confront the systems that perpetuate harm, to question the norms that prioritize power over people, and to resist the temptation to stay silent in the face of injustice. The invitation was to join the fight, to become part of the movements, conversations, and actions that would shape a more equitable future. As Nathaniel prepared to leave the hospital for the night, he paused one last time at the entrance, looking out over the city. The path ahead was uncertain, but he no longer felt afraid. He had faced the storm and emerged stronger, ready to continue the work. And as he walked into the night, his silhouette fading into the glow of the city lights, one thing was clear: this was just the beginning.